he found his father's handwriting on the inside of the barn wall the morning everything began. He hadn't been looking for it. He had gone into the barn before sunrise, the way he did every morning, lantern in hand, Rex moving silently at his heel, to check the water line that had been freezing in the November cold. He was crouched in the far corner, hands working the pipe fitting, when the lantern light caught something on the old timber beam directly above him. Words, written in pencil, worn almost to nothing by 60 years of cold and dust and time. He stood slowly and brought the lantern close. Thomas Earl Thompson. His barn. His land. His family. November 14th, 1961. His father's handwriting. That careful, slightly slanted script Jack had seen on grocery lists and birthday cards and the backs of old photographs his whole life. His father had stood in this exact corner of this exact barn, younger than Jack had been on his first deployment, and pressed a pencil to this beam and written his name on the thing he loved most in the world. Jack read the words 4 times. Then he reached up and touched the letters with 2 fingers, gently, the way you touch something you were afraid of losing, and felt the faint grooves the pencil had left in the wood 6 decades ago. His barn, his land, his family. Rex made no sound beside him. He simply leaned the full, warm weight of his shoulder against Jack's leg and stayed there. Jack stood in the lantern light with his fingers on his father's words and felt something move through his chest that had no name and did not need one. Something that was grief and gratitude and love all pressed together into a single quiet ache. He might have stood there a long time, but then he heard the trucks. 2 of them, rolling slow up the gravel drive with their headlights off, and Jack knew before he reached the barn door that this was not a neighbor. Neighbors didn't come before dawn. Neighbors didn't cut their lights in the dark. He turned the lantern off. Rex was already at the door, ears perfectly forward, body absolutely still, reading the darkness the way Jack had learned over 14 years to trust without question. 4 men stepped out of the trucks into the frost. One moved immediately toward the north fence line, the fence Jack's grandfather had built post by post across an entire summer in 1947. Another carried something long and dark at his side. Jack stood in the barn doorway and watched, and felt that old familiar thing wake up at the base of his spine. Not anger, not fear, something quieter and more dangerous than either. The part of him that had been sleeping for 4 years in the peace of this farm and was now, without drama or urgency, simply awake. He put his hand on Rex's back. Rex didn't move, didn't make a sound. They stood together in the darkness and waited, the way soldiers wait, with the absolute patience of men who understand that the first move belongs to someone else, and that patience itself is a form of power. Jack Thompson had come home to Thompson Ridge Farm 4 years ago, carrying less than he'd left with. 2 duffel bags, a discharge paper, 22 years of memories he had sorted through carefully on the long flight home, keeping only what he needed, the way you strip a field pack before a march you know will be hard. He had come home at 50 with a body that had earned every one of its quiet complaints, and a mind that had learned at considerable cost the difference between being watchful and being at war. He had also come home with Rex. Rex had been assigned to Jack's unit in the final deployment, a German shepherd of remarkable intelligence and a stillness that unsettled younger soldiers until they understood it. He and Jack had worked together for 26 months in conditions that built the kind of trust no training program could manufacture or rush. When Jack received his discharge, the handlers had offered Rex to him with the quiet formality of people performing a ceremony they genuinely believed in. Jack had accepted without a word, and had not spent a single night without Rex since. Thompson Ridge Farm was 65 acres of rolling Tennessee land that had belonged to the Thompson family for 140 years. Pasture and orchard and old timber, every inch of it saturated with the presence of people Jack had spent his military years missing without always knowing that's what the ache was. His great-great-grandfather had purchased the land after returning from a war the family remembered without naming. Every generation since had worked it, added to it, protected it with the particular devotion of people who understand that some things are not owned, only held, carefully, for those who come next. Jack's parents were buried on the eastern slope beneath 2 white oak trees they had planted together the year they were married. His sister Mary still lived in the farmhouse. Mary was 53 and had the specific, unannounced strength of a woman who had stayed when staying cost her something real. She had left a teaching position in Nashville to come home when their mother got sick, and she had never gone back, and she had never once framed it as sacrifice, which was, Jack had always thought, the truest kind of sacrifice there was. It was Mary who first set the newspaper on the kitchen table. October, a thin Tuesday evening, the county paper folded to a photograph of a man in an expensive coat standing before an architect's rendering of something called Ridgecrest Reserve. "He's bought everything on the north and west sides," Mary said quietly. She remained standing. 300 acres in 14 months. Cash purchases, every one of them. Jack looked at the photograph. Daniel Cross was smiling at it, the practiced smile of a man who had learned that confidence, correctly displayed, was its own form of pressure. "He'll come here next," Mary said. Jack looked at his sister. He saw their father in her jaw, their mother in her eyes. He saw 4 generations of people who had worked this land without complaint and protected it without recognition and asked the world for nothing except the right to remain on it. "Let him," Jack said. Cross's first representative arrived 3 weeks later, young, clean-jacketed, aggressively pleasant. Jack met him at the gate with Rex sitting at his left side. "Mr. Thompson, my employer is prepared to make a very generous—" "No." The man blinked. "Sir, if you just allow me to present—" "I heard you clearly. The answer is no." The man looked at Rex once, at the absolute patient stillness of him, and then looked back at Jack and nodded and left. The second visit brought 2 larger men who spoke about market forces and development momentum and how things tend to go when progress reaches a certain point. Jack listened to all of it without expression, standing at the gate in the gray afternoon light, hands quiet at his sides. "You've got a nice piece of land here," the larger one said, in a tone that carried its threat the way cold carries cold, invisibly, completely. "Yes," Jack said simply. "I do." They left, but that night someone walked the north fence line with wire snippers and cut it in 3 places. Clean cuts. Deliberate. Not vandalism. A message, written in the language of intimidation that Jack had learned to read long before these men were practicing it. He repaired the fence at dawn, working in the frost with Rex beside him, neither of them speaking, the cold air sharp in his lungs. Then he went back to the barn and mounted cameras on all 4 corners. He did not tell Mary how dark it was getting. But Mary knew. She had known things about Jack without being told since he was 7 years old, and 2 decades of military silence had not changed that. She found him at the kitchen table 11 days later, past 10 at night, reviewing camera footage on his laptop. Rex was asleep at his feet. The farmhouse was quiet around them, the particular quiet of old houses that have absorbed generations of human living and hold it in their walls like warmth. Mary sat down across from him and set something on the table between them. A photograph. Jack looked down at it. His father, standing in the east orchard in what must have been the early 1980s, maybe 40 years old, one hand resting on the trunk of an apple tree, squinting into the summer sun, smiling the way Thomas Thompson smiled, like he was trying not to but couldn't help it. "I found it in Mama's Bible," Mary said softly, "in the back with the birth records." Jack looked at the photograph and did not speak. "He used to say," Mary continued, her voice careful and low, "that this land wasn't ours to give away, that we were only ever holding it." She paused. "For the ones who came before and the ones coming after." The kitchen clock ticked. Somewhere in the orchard the wind moved through bare November branches. "I keep thinking about that," Mary said. "About what it means to hold something when someone is trying to take it from you." Jack looked at his father's face, that reluctant, helpless smile, that hand on the apple tree, and felt the tightening in the center of his chest that had been building for weeks and had no outlet and no name. "I'm not letting go, Mary," he said. She nodded once and stood and put her hand briefly on his shoulder as she passed, just for a moment, just the weight of her hand, and went to bed. Jack sat alone at the table with his father's photograph and Rex asleep at his feet, and the cold farmhouse settling around him. And he understood, with the quiet certainty of a man who has spent his life in service to things larger than himself, that what was coming would ask everything of him. He was ready. That same night he did something he had not done since coming home. He walked in the dark to the eastern slope. The frost was heavy, and the sky was enormous, and the two white oak trees stood above his parents' graves like they have stood for 30 years, patient and permanent and completely indifferent to everything the world had tried to do in the time since Thomas and Eleanor Thompson had been laid in this ground. Jack stood between the two graves and looked at his parents' names on the simple stones and did not speak. There was nothing to say that the night didn't already know. He had come here the way you go to the place where the people who made you are resting. Not for answers, not for comfort exactly, but simply to be near them, to stand in their presence, to let them know, in the only way still possible, that he was still here, that he wasn't going anywhere. Rex had followed him without being called, and now, without a word from Jack, without a gesture or a command, Rex walked forward and lay down in the frost between the two graves, his chin resting on his paws, his eyes open, his breathing slow and steady. Lying there like a guardian, like he had always known this was part of his job. Jack looked down at Rex for a long moment. Then he crouched and put one hand flat on his mother's grave and one hand flat on his father's grave and felt the cold ground beneath his palms and the 140 years of family in the soil and the 62-year-old pencil marks in the barn beam and the photograph of his father laughing in the orchard and every fence post and apple tree and weathered barn board that bore the fingerprints of people he had loved. He stayed like that until the cold moved through him completely. Then he stood, and Rex stood with him, and they walked back to the farmhouse together through the dark. They came in force on a Thursday night, 6 men in 2 trucks with their headlights off, and Jack was waiting on the porch before they reached the yard. He had been ready for 2 weeks, every incident logged, every camera running, the sheriff's non-emergency line on speed dial, the documentation precise and complete in the same spare handwriting he had used for mission reports in places he never named at dinner tables. The largest man spread his arms wide when he saw Jack on the porch, one aging figure in the dark with nothing but a dog, and laughed with the easy confidence of someone who has never been genuinely tested. "Last chance, old man. Mr. Cross is losing his patience. Sign tonight or we make sure this farm becomes more trouble than it's worth." Rex stood at Jack's left side. He did not growl, did not bark, did not shift his weight or lower his head. He simply stood in the darkness beside Jack with the absolute, unperformable stillness of a creature that has already decided everything it needs to decide. And that stillness, somehow, was the most frightening thing in the yard. Jack looked at the 6 men below him. He looked at the barn behind them, his grandfather's barn, built in 1951, his father's name written on the inside beam in careful pencil. He looked at the dark outline of the east orchard, where the trees his great-grandmother planted still bore fruit every spring without being asked. Then he looked back at the man who was still smiling. "You're trespassing on documented private property," Jack said. His voice was quiet and even and carried completely in the cold air. "Every one of your faces in both of your vehicles have been recorded since you turned onto my drive. The sheriff's department has been notified and is currently en route." He paused for one breath. "I am a retired Army infantry sergeant, 22 years of service. I have stood in places that would unmake every one of you before you understood what was happening." Another pause. Quieter still. "I am asking you to leave my family's land." The smile on the large man's face went uncertain at the edges. Rex still hadn't moved. Two men stepped back. Then the tree line at the far end of the drive went white with approaching headlights, and the night cracked open, and 6 men made the only decision left available to them. Justice moved the way it always moves, slowly and without drama, and with the grinding, unglamorous weight of documented truth. Jack's records formed the foundation of 3 civil complaints. 2 neighboring landowners came forward once they saw that one man had refused to fall. A county journalist named Sarah Holt spent 3 weeks pulling the threads of Cross's acquisition methods until the full shape of it became visible to anyone who looked, and what she published traveled far beyond the county paper. Cross's project was suspended. Investigations opened. His company's legal troubles multiplied in the way that legal troubles do when the foundation beneath them is finally examined. The farm stayed. Jack never testified with anger or performance. He sat in the county courthouse the way he stood on his porch, weight balanced, hands still, voice level, and answered every question with the unhurried precision of a man who documented everything because he was trained to, and who was trained to because the truth, carefully recorded, is the most durable weapon there is. By February, the neighbors came. 14 of them on a cold Saturday morning with paint rollers and brushes and thermoses of coffee, and they covered the last red letters on the barn door with 3 coats of clean white. Mary stood in the yard watching and pressed her lips together very carefully and tilted her face up toward the sky for a long moment, and Jack stood beside her and did not say anything because there was nothing that needed saying. Rex moved among the neighbors all morning, accepting their hands on his back with the dignified patience of someone who understands he is trusted. In spring, a boy named Tommy began coming on Saturday afternoons. 8 years old, his grandfather's grandson, more naturally comfortable with silence than most adults Jack had known. They worked the fence lines together in the long afternoon light, Tommy listening with his entire body, Jack explaining each step once in plain language, and then stepping back and letting the boy try. One warm afternoon, Tommy looked up from a fence post and said, "Rex never barks." "Only when it matters," Jack said. Tommy considered this with the complete seriousness of a child who recognizes he is being told something true. Then he went back to the post. There is an evening Jack returns to, when the light goes long and gold through the east orchard and the apple trees are in their spring bloom, white flowers trembling in a soft wind, and the farm is simply itself, unhurried and enduring, and ancient and alive. He is sitting on the porch steps. Rex is beside him. The 2 white oaks on the eastern slope are dark against the pale evening sky, and somewhere beneath them his parents are resting in the ground they loved. He thinks about a young man standing in a barn corner in November of 1961, pressing a pencil to a beam, writing his name on the thing he loved most. His barn, his land, his family. He thinks about what it means to be the next person in that line, to be the one in whose hands the holding falls, to repair what breaks, to stand when standing is the only thing asked of you, to refuse, simply, completely, without theater or anger, to let go of what you were given to keep. He reaches over and puts his hand on Rex's back. Rex leans into it, just slightly, just enough. The orchard holds its blossoms in the fading light. The white oaks stand on the slope. The old barn behind them carries 60 years of pencil marks on its beams and the fingerprints of everyone who ever loved this place, pressed into every board and beam and stone. And Jack Thompson sits in the quiet of his family's land and understands, more deeply and more peacefully than he has ever understood anything, that he is exactly where he is supposed to be. That he held what he was given to hold. That some things, when you refuse to release them, become permanent. Not because the world allowed it, but because one person decided they would not let go. There is a kind of courage the world rarely photographs or celebrates. It doesn't charge forward. It doesn't make speeches. It doesn't ask to be remembered. It wakes before dawn. It repairs what was broken overnight. It walks to the graves of its parents in the cold dark and puts its hands on the frozen ground and makes a silent promise to people who can no longer hear it in words, but somehow, in the soil, in the trees, in the pencil marks on the barn beam, still know. Jack Thompson learned that courage from his father. His father learned it from his. And Rex, faithful, quiet, permanent Rex, understood it from the very beginning. That's why, on the coldest night of the year, he walked to those graves without being asked and lay down between them like a guardian. Because loyalty doesn't need to be commanded. It simply knows where it belongs. If this story settled somewhere inside you, if it reminded you of someone who held something together quietly, without recognition, without complaint, then you already understand what Jack Thompson understood. Subscribe to Jack and Rex Tales. Every story we tell is for people who believe that quiet courage is the most powerful kind, that loyalty still means something, that the land beneath our feet and the people who came before us, and the faithful companions who never leave our side, that these things are worth protecting with everything we have. Because they are. They always were.